The searing Arizona sun beat down on the unforgiving landscape, the only witness to the lone woman's struggle. Dust and sweat caked her face, her knuckles raw and bleeding. Below her, the whimpers of the vanquished coyotes faded into the vast silence of the desert. She had won, but the victory was short-lived. A groan from the shadows, a sound barely human, drew her attention. There against the red rocks lay a man, an Apache warrior, his body a canvas of pain. As she knelt beside him, his eyes fluttered open, and a single impossible word escaped his lips: Abigail. The land was a devil's anvil, a place where the sun hammered out souls, leaving them either tempered or broken. Abigail Hayes had been on that anvil for 5 years, and she was yet to break. Her homestead, a stubborn speck of life carved into the ochre dust and skeletal saguaros of the Arizona Territory, was her penance and her sanctuary. It was a place where the past with its silken dresses and suffocating expectations could not reach her, or so she prayed. Her hands, once accustomed to the delicate touch of ivory piano keys, were now calloused and scarred. They knew the heft of an axe, the recoil of a Winchester, and the gritty texture of the soil that begrudgingly gave her a meager garden. She was 30 years old, but the desert had etched a decade more onto her face, leaving fine lines around her eyes that were perpetually narrowed against the glare. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was ruthlessly braided and tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. This day the anvil was hotter than most. The air shimmered, distorting the distant mesas into wavering specters. Her lone cow, Jezebel, was lowing restlessly in the small, shaded corral she'd built. It was the lack of water. The creek was a ghost of its former self, a muddy trickle that promised nothing. It was this thirst that had driven the coyotes mad. She'd heard their yips and howls grow bolder over the last week, a ragged chorus that frayed the edges of the night. But today they came in the daylight, their ribs showing, their eyes gleaming with a desperate, unnerving intelligence. There were 4 of them, a pack of sinew and teeth, and they weren't after her chickens. They were after the calf born just 2 weeks prior, a wobbly creature that was her sole hope for future sustenance. Abigail didn't hesitate. The Winchester was in the cabin too far. The pistol on her hip was for men, not for a fast-moving pack. She grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a thick, gnarled piece of mesquite she used for splitting kindling. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silent indifference of the desert. The first coyote lunged, a blur of mangy fur and snapping jaws. She swung the mesquite club with a grunt, connecting with its skull with a sickening crack. It crumpled, but the others were on her. One latched onto the thick leather of her boot, another feinted left, trying to circle around her to get to the bawling calf. The fight was a primal ballet of dust and desperation. Abigail was no longer the woman who had once debated philosophy in Boston parlors. She was a cornered animal, fighting with a ferocity that came from the very rock and sand beneath her feet. She kicked the coyote off her boot, her leg screaming in protest. She swung the club again and again, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She drove them back, her arms burning, her vision tunneling. She used her bare hands, punching and shoving, her knuckles splitting against bone and fur. And then it was over. One lay dead, another writhed with a broken leg, and the other 2, beaten and whimpering, dragged themselves away into the thorny embrace of the scrub brush. Abigail stood chest-heaving, leaning on the club like a scepter. The metallic tang of blood, hers and theirs, filled her nostrils. She tasted dust grit and the bitter flavor of survival. Victory felt less like triumph and more like exhaustion. It was then she heard it. Not the cry of a coyote or the frantic lowing of the cow, but a human sound. A groan, low and guttural, pulled from the depths of profound pain. Her gaze snapped toward a cluster of sun-baked boulders near the edge of her property, a place she rarely went. The sound came again, weaker this time. With the club still in her hand, she moved cautiously, her senses still screaming with the adrenaline of the fight. He lay in the sliver of shade offered by an overhang of rock, half hidden. At first, she thought he was dead. He was Apache, that much was clear from the beaded deerskin leggings and the single eagle feather tied into his long black hair, now matted with dirt and blood. A deep gash, crusted and angry, ran from his temple down his cheek, but it was the wound in his side that was killing him. A dark, ugly stain spread across his torso, the work of a bullet. He was young, perhaps her age, with strong features that were now slack with pain. A broken bow lay near one hand, a testament to a fight he had lost. She was a white woman alone. He was an Apache warrior, a specter of the violence that haunted the edges of this territory. Every instinct, every story she'd ever been told screamed at her to back away. Leave him. Let the desert claim him as it claimed everything else. To help him was to invite a world of trouble she could not possibly handle. He was likely from one of the bands that had been clashing with the cavalry, maybe even with the local ranchers. To harbor him was a crime. To be found with him would be a death sentence one way or another. She took a step back, then another. He was nothing to her, but as she turned, his eyelids thin and papery fluttered. They opened just a crack. His eyes were as black as obsidian, clouded with agony, but for a fleeting moment they focused on her. His lips, cracked and dry, parted. A whisper so faint it was almost carried away by the breeze, slithered through the air and coiled itself around her heart. Abigail. The world stopped. The sun, the heat, the buzzing flies, it all ceased to exist. It was her name, not a plea for help, not a curse, but her name. Spoken in a voice that held the ghost of an accent, but was undeniably clear. How could this dying stranger, this Apache from the wilderness, know the name she had buried 5 years ago? The name that belonged to another life, 1,000 miles away. No one in the town of Redemption, 10 miles hence, knew her as Abigail. She was Miss Hayes, the quiet woman who bought flour and salt and spoke to no one. The shock was a physical blow more stunning than a coyote attack. It rooted her to the spot. Her mind, usually a fortress of logic and pragmatism, became a whirlwind of impossible questions. Who was he? How did he know her? Was this a trick? A fever dream? His eyes slid closed again. His breathing became a shallow, rattling thing. The desert offered 2 choices: leave him to die with his secret, or risk everything to understand it. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but the mystery was a hook sinking deep into her soul. To let him die now would be to live with the echo of that whispered name for the rest of her days, a ghost she could never exorcise. With a curse that was half prayer, Abigail Hayes made her choice. She dropped the bloodied mesquite club. Bracing herself against the searing rock, she hooked her arms under his, her battered hands protesting the strain. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Gritting her teeth, she began to drag the injured warrior, the man who knew her name, away from the shadow of the rocks and toward the dubious sanctuary of her home. The long, agonizing journey across the sun-scorched earth had just begun, and with every step she dragged the past, the present, and a terrifyingly uncertain future along with her. The floorboards of her cabin groaned in protest as she hauled him inside. The single room was her entire world, a cot in one corner, a small stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs and shelves lined with tins jars and the few books she'd carried with her into exile. It was sparse, but it was clean, a small bastion of order against the chaos outside. Now that chaos lay bleeding on her floor, for a moment she stood over him, panting, her mind racing. The absurdity of the situation was a bitter pill. She, Abigail Hayes, formerly Abigail Sterling of the Philadelphia Sterlings, a family whose name was whispered with the same reverence as Carnegie or Vanderbilt, was now harboring a wounded Apache warrior, who had somehow plucked her given name from the ether. His unconsciousness was a temporary mercy. It allowed her to work without the complication of his gaze, without having to answer the unasked questions that hung in the air. With a renewed sense of purpose, she went to work. She tore strips from one of her few clean linen sheets, the fine fabric a stark contrast to the grim task at hand. She boiled water over the fire, her movements efficient and practiced. Survival had been a harsh but thorough teacher. Cleaning the wound in his side was a stomach-turning ordeal. The bullet was still in there lodged deep. The flesh around it was hot and inflamed, an angry red against his sun-darkened skin. She knew with a sinking certainty that without getting the bullet out, he would die of infection if he didn't bleed to death first. Probing for a bullet was far beyond her experience. His other wounds were more manageable. The gash on his face was deep but clean. As she gently washed away the blood and grime, she saw the face beneath. It was a strong face with high cheekbones and a proud, aquiline nose. Even slack in unconsciousness, there was an undeniable dignity to it, a stoicism that seemed carved into his very bones. Tattoos, fine black lines in geometric patterns, marked his jaw and the backs of his hands. They were stories she could not read. He began to shiver, a violent, bone-rattling tremor that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat of the cabin. Fever was setting in. He muttered in his own language the words guttural and strange to her ears, punctuated by her own name, a name that sounded both alien and terrifyingly familiar on his tongue. Abigail. He'd groan, followed by a stream of Apache. Panic began to prickle at the edges of her composure. She was in over her head. She needed help. But the only help was 10 miles away in Redemption, a town that existed in a delicate, often violent balance between prospectors' ranchers and the ever-present shadow of the U.S. cavalry. To bring a doctor out here, even if she could afford one, would be to sign the man's death warrant and likely her own. Her mind seized on one name, Maria. Maria Garcia ran the mercantile in Redemption. She was a woman older than the territory itself, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes holding the wisdom of generations who had understood this land long before men like Abigail's father had tried to tame it. Maria traded with everyone miners, settlers, and it was whispered even the Apache from time to time. She knew herbs' remedies and the art of keeping her mouth shut. Leaving the warrior was a risk, but letting him die was not an option. Not until she had her answer. She placed a wet cloth on his forehead, secured the door, and took the horse, pushing it harder than she ever had before. The ride to Redemption was a blur of anxiety. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a warning. The town, when she reached it, was its usual self, a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings, the air thick with the smell of horse manure, cheap whiskey, and simmering tension. Men watched her as she dismounted, their gazes lingering. A lone woman was always a curiosity, a prize, or a problem. She found Maria behind the counter of her cluttered store, a place that smelled of cinnamon coffee beans and tanned leather. "Miss Hayes," Maria said, her voice calm and steady. "You look like you have seen a ghost." Abigail leaned against the counter, her breath still ragged. "I need your help, Maria. I found a man, hurt badly, a bullet." Maria's dark eyes sharpened. She didn't ask the obvious questions who, where, why. She simply asked the important one. "White man." Abigail hesitated for a fraction of a second. "No." The older woman's expression didn't change, but a deep understanding passed between them. Maria reached under the counter and began to gather items, a small pouch of willow bark for the fever, another of dried yarrow to pack the wound and stop the bleeding, and a small, sharp-looking knife wrapped in oilcloth. "This is a dangerous road you walk, mija," Maria said softly, using the affectionate Spanish term for daughter. "There is a new man in the valley, a rancher. Blackwood is his name. He has bought up the old Miller Ranch and a dozen other claims. He is a man with a long shadow and a short temper, especially when it comes to the people." The name Blackwood meant nothing to Abigail. He was just another faceless threat in a land full of them. "I don't have a choice," she said, her voice low. "We always have a choice," Maria corrected gently. "You have chosen this one." She pushed a small, heavy bottle across the counter. "Whiskey, for him before you cut, and for you after." Abigail paid with the last of her coins, her hand trembling slightly as she took the supplies. As she turned to leave, Maria's voice stopped her. "The man you found," she said, her tone serious. "Does he have a name?" Abigail thought of the impossible whisper. I don't know," she lied. Back at the cabin, the fever had taken full hold. The warrior, her patient, her prisoner, her mystery was delirious. He thrashed against the cot, his eyes wide and unseeing, staring into a past that was a world away from hers. And it was in that delirium that fragments of his story and hers began to surface. He spoke in a torrent of Apache, but his visions, it seemed, were in English. He would cry out names. "Sergeant Miller!" he yelled once, his voice filled with venom. Then softer, "Nalin," a name spoken with such tenderness it made Abigail's heart ache. But it was the other words, the other images that swam up from the depths of his fevered mind that truly terrified her. The carriages, so much noise. He muttered, his brow furrowed. Green grass, not like here. Water everywhere. Locked gates. Abigail froze the whiskey bottle halfway to her lips. Green grass, locked gates. It sounded like a fever dream description of an eastern estate. Sterling. The Sterling house? He gasped, his body arching in pain. Big, cold. They watched from the windows. The whiskey bottle slipped from her fingers and crashed to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Sterling. He had said her family name. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a random guess. This man, this Apache warrior, somehow knew the gilded cage she had fled. Suddenly her own past came rushing back, not as a distant memory, but as a visceral, suffocating presence. She remembered the Sterling mansion outside Philadelphia, a place of cold marble and colder glances. She remembered her father, a man who measured his daughter's worth in the advantageousness of her marriage, and she remembered Silas Blackwood. Silas, her fiancé, a man chosen by her father. Silas was handsome, wealthy, from a family as old and powerful as their own. And he was cruel, not in an obvious brutish way, but in a quiet, chilling manner. The way he would grip her arm just a little too tightly, the coldness in his eyes when she dared to voice an opinion, the dismissive smile that never reached them. He saw her as a beautiful possession, another asset to be acquired. Her escape had not been just from her family, but from him. She had staged a riding accident, let a story of her tragic death circulate, and used a secret fund her sympathetic mother had left her to disappear into the vast anonymity of the West. Now, as she stared at the delirious man on her cot, a horrifying possibility began to dawn. How could his path and hers have ever crossed? Had he been a scout, a prisoner? She steeled herself. The bullet had to come out. Following Maria's advice, she poured a little of the remaining whiskey between his lips. He coughed and sputtered, but swallowed some. Taking a deep breath, she took the small, sharp knife, sterilized it in the flames of a candle, and began to cut. The hours that followed were a waking nightmare. He screamed, a raw animal sound of pure agony that threatened to break her resolve. He fought her, his delirious strength almost too much for her. She had to throw her entire body over him, to hold him down, her own tears, mingling with the sweat on her face. But she did not stop. Guided by instinct and desperation, she probed the wound, her fingers searching for the small, deadly piece of lead. Finally, she felt it. A small, hard lump lodged against a rib. With a final, desperate effort, she worked it loose. The bullet, slick with blood, dropped into a tin bowl with a clatter. He went limp, his body finally succumbing to the trauma. His breathing was shallow, but it was there. She packed the wound with the yarrow Maria had given her and bandaged it tightly. Exhausted, covered in his blood and her own sweat, she slumped into the chair opposite the cot. The cabin was silent now, save for his faint breaths and the crackle of the fire. The storm had passed, leaving a fragile, uncertain calm. She had saved him for now, but in doing so, she had unearthed a ghost. The man on her cot was a living link to a past she had nearly died to escape. The mystery of how he knew her name was no longer a curiosity. It was a threat. His presence here in her sanctuary had just turned the key in a lock she thought she had thrown away forever. And outside, under the vast, uncaring desert sky, a man named Blackwood was building an empire, a man she prayed would never learn that the woman he thought was dead was very much alive. The fragile peace of Abigail's world had been shattered, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the silence would not last. Days bled into one another, measured by the rising and setting of a relentless sun. The warrior whose name she still did not know clung to life by a thread. The fever lingered, a stubborn beast, but the violent delirium subsided, replaced by a deep, healing sleep. Abigail fell into a routine dictated by his needs, boiling water, changing dressings, forcing sips of broth between his lips, and watching. Always watching. She slept in the chair, the Winchester leaning against its legs. Trust was a currency she didn't possess. Every time he stirred or muttered, she would be awake instantly, her hand reaching for the rifle. Who was he? Was he a scout for a hostile band? A renegade? Was his knowledge of her a weapon he was waiting to use? During the long, quiet hours, her own past was a constant, unwelcome companion. The name, Silas Blackwood, spoken by Maria, had been a spark in a tinderbox. Now, with the warrior's fevered mentions of the Sterling house, the fire was raging. She saw Silas's face in the flickering firelight, the patrician features, the thin, unsmiling lips, the possessive gleam in his pale blue eyes. She remembered the night she'd made her decision to flee. He had presented her with a wedding gift, a diamond necklace. As he fastened it, his fingers cold against her skin, he'd whispered, "It is a collar, my dear, a beautiful collar for a beautiful prize." That night she had pried the jewels from their setting and sewn them into the hem of her plainest dress. They were the seeds of her new life. On the 5th day she was washing the bloodstains from the floor when she felt his eyes on her. She looked up slowly. He was awake. The fever had broken, and the obsidian eyes that watched her were clear, lucid, and filled with an unnerving intelligence. The silence stretched thick with unspoken questions. "Water!" He rasped, his voice raw. She brought it to him in a tin cup, holding his head up so he could drink. He drank deeply, his gaze never leaving her face. After he sank back onto the cot, his breath still shallow. "You are Abigail," he stated. It wasn't a question. Her heart hammered. "How do you know that name?" she demanded, her voice tighter than she intended. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "I saw you," he said finally, his English slow and deliberate but clear. "A long time ago, a world away from this one." He began to speak, and the story he wove was more fantastic and horrifying than anything she could have imagined. His name was Kyle. He and his younger sister Nalin had been captured years ago, not by the army, but by slavers who sold them to a wealthy landowner in the east. They weren't slaves in name, but in reality indentured servants with no hope of escape. The landowner's estate was next to the Sterlings. "I worked in the stables," Cale said, his eyes fixed on some distant memory. "I was a boy. I saw you riding. You wore a green dress. You rode like the wind, your hair flying behind you. You were the only thing in that place that looked free." Abigail stared at him speechless. She remembered the green dress. She remembered the brief period where she'd found her only solace in riding, pushing her horse to its limits, as if she could outrun her own gilded cage. "The stable hands, the servants. They spoke of you," Cale continued. "The daughter of the big house. Abigail. They said you were to be married to a man with cold eyes." Silas. "My sister Naylan. She got sick. The coughing sickness. The owner would not pay for a doctor. He said she was damaged goods." A muscle tightened in Kael's jaw, a flash of the warrior beneath the wounded man. "She died in my arms. After that, there was nothing left for me there but hate. I took a horse. I rode west. I rode until I found my people again." The cabin was silent. The story settled around them, a truth so strange and powerful it altered the very air she breathed. He wasn't a threat. He was a survivor just like her. They were two people from opposite ends of the universe, both scarred by the same gilded world, both having fled to the desert to escape a form of bondage. The wall of suspicion in Abigail's heart didn't just crack. It crumbled. She saw not an Apache warrior, but a man named Kael who had lost everything and still found his way home. "I am sorry," she whispered the words inadequate for the depth of his loss. "About your sister." He simply nodded, a deep, profound grief in his eyes. "You fought the Coyotes," he said, changing the subject. "I saw before the darkness." He looked at her split knuckles, the fading bruises on her arms. "You fight like a warrior." A fragile truce bloomed in the small cabin, nurtured by shared stories and a growing, unspoken respect. He began to heal. He taught her a few words in his language. She read to him from one of her books. The space between the cot and the chair shrank until she was sitting on the edge of his bed, changing his dressing without the Winchester by her side. But the world outside their sanctuary was not idle. One afternoon, a rider approached, not the shambling gait of a prospector, but the confident, straight-backed posture of a man who owned the ground he rode over. Abigail's blood ran cold. She knew, even before he was close enough to see clearly who it was. The cut of his coat, the expensive bay horse, they were echoes of a life she had buried. Kael, sitting up for the first time, saw the look on her face. "Who is it?" "A ghost," she whispered. The rider dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He was older, his face weathered by the western sun, but it was unmistakably him. Silas Blackwood. He walked to her door, his pale eyes sweeping over her homestead with a look of disdainful appraisal. He had not recognized her. To him, she was just another squatter on a piece of land he wanted. "Quite the hovel you've got here," he said, his voice the same smooth, condescending baritone she remembered with a shudder. "I am Silas Blackwood. I own this valley, and you, madam, are on my land." "This is my claim," Abigail said, her voice steady despite the hurricane in her chest. "Filed and legal." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Pieces of paper are for back east. Out here, ownership is simpler. I want this plot. There's a spring nearby. Water is power here. I'll give you $200 for your trouble." It was a pittance, but it was the way he looked at her, the assumption of her immediate compliance, that stoked her anger. "It's not for sale," she said. His eyes narrowed. For the first time, he was truly looking at her, past the worn clothes and the sun-browned skin. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, then dawning, incredulous recognition. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Abigail." He breathed the name, a curse on his lips. "It can't be. You're dead." "Reports were exaggerated," she said, her voice dripping with ice. His shock curdled into a dark, possessive fury. "You," he snarled, taking a step forward. "You ran from me. You embarrassed my family. You belong to me." "I belong to no one," she shot back, standing her ground. It was then that Kael appeared in the doorway behind her. He was leaning heavily on the doorframe, still weak, but he was standing. He wore a pair of her deceased father's old trousers she'd found in her trunk, and his bare chest was tightly bandaged, but his presence was a potent declaration. Silas's gaze flickered to Cale, and his face twisted in a mask of pure bigotry. "What is this?" he spat. "You trade a Blackwood for a red-skinned savage?" The venom in his voice was so potent it seemed to poison the air. He looked from Cale's proud, defiant face to Abigail's. The pieces clicked into place in his mind in the most loathsome way possible. "I see," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "This is what you've become." He backed away toward his horse, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "The offer is withdrawn. This is my valley. You have 1 week to be off this land. If you're still here when I return, I'll burn this cabin to the ground with both of you inside." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. Abigail stood trembling not with fear, but with rage. The past had not just found her. It had come to claim her more monstrous and real than ever before. She looked back at Cale, who was watching her, his dark eyes filled with a grim understanding. "The man with the cold eyes," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. The fragile peace was gone, shattered by the ghost from her past. The fight for her homestead was no longer about a piece of land or a hidden spring. It was a fight for her very soul, for the freedom she had sacrificed everything to find. And now, she would not be fighting it alone. She and Cale, 2 survivors from 2 different worlds, stood together on a patch of sun-baked earth, the battle lines drawn, waiting for the coming storm. The week that followed was not one of fear, but of furious preparation. The threat from Silas Blackwood had forged a new and potent alliance between Abigail and Cale. The sanctuary of the cabin became a war room. They were no longer patient and protector. They were partner soldiers in a war with only 2 recruits. Abigail's terror had crystallized into a hard, defiant resolve. Silas had made a fatal error. He had cornered her, and like the Coyotes, he would find she had teeth. "He will not come himself, not at first," Cale said, his voice gaining strength each day. He was now able to walk, albeit slowly, around the cabin. "He will send his men. Men like him think their money makes them kings. They do not like to get their own hands dirty." Cale, despite his weakness, began to teach her. He showed her how to read the land not as a landscape, but as a map of advantages and disadvantages. He pointed out the natural choke points in the rocky terrain, the blind spots, the places an ambush could be set. He taught her how to muffle the sound of her footsteps, how to use the rising sun and the setting sun to her advantage. In turn, Abigail taught him about her rifle. The Winchester was an extension of her arm, but Cale held it with a reverent curiosity. His own weapon had been the bow, a tool of silence and skill. The rifle was a weapon of thunder and finality. He learned quickly, his keen eyes making him a natural marksman. They practiced in a small hidden arroyo, the shots echoing through the canyons, a declaration of their defiance. In these moments of shared purpose, something deeper grew between them. It was in the way he would watch her, a look of profound respect in his dark eyes. It was in the way she would instinctively reach out to steady him when he grew tired. They spoke of their pasts, not with sorrow, but with the quiet understanding of fellow survivors. They were 2 lonely souls who had found an anchor in the most unlikely of circumstances. One evening, as they sat by the fire cleaning their weapons, he reached out and gently touched the scar on her knuckles, a souvenir from her fight with the Coyotes. "The hands of a warrior," he said softly. She did not pull away. In his touch there was no possession, only a shared strength. "We do what we must to survive," she replied, her voice quiet. "No," he corrected. "We do what we must to live." A few days later, just as Cale had predicted, Silas's men came. There were 3 of them, rough-looking men with the SB brand of the Blackwood Ranch on their saddles. They didn't ride up to the cabin. Instead, they took a position on a nearby ridge, their message clear they were watching. That night, under the cover of darkness, they made their move. They didn't storm the cabin. Their goal was to break her spirit. Abigail awoke to the frantic bawling of Jezebel, her cow. Rushing outside, she saw two of the men cutting the fence to her corral, trying to drive off her precious few animals. A shot rang out not from her Winchester but from the dark shape of the rocks behind the cabin. One of the men yelled and clutched his arm, the rifle he was holding clattering to the ground. It was Kyle. He had taken up a sniper's position using the terrain just as he had taught her. A second shot kicked up the dust at the other man's feet, sending him scrambling for cover. Abigail raised her own rifle and fired not at the men, but at the ground near their horses, spooking the animals. The raiders, one of them wounded, and both now on foot, cursed and vanished into the night. They had won the first skirmish. But the victory was sobering. This was just the beginning. The next day, Sheriff Brody rode out from Redemption. He was a portly man with a weary face and a tarnished star pinned to his vest. He dismounted heavily, his eyes taking in the fortified look of the small homestead. "Ma'am," he sighed, removing his hat, "I'm here on a friendly warning. Silas Blackwood runs this territory. He's got money, he's got influence, and he's got a temper. He's convinced the town council that you're harboring a hostile renegade. The man in my cabin is a guest recovering from his injuries," Abigail stated coldly. "The only hostility I've seen has come from Mr. Blackwood's men." Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably. "People are scared, ma'am. There's been trouble with Cochise bands to the south. Any Apache is seen as a threat right now. Blackwood is stoking that fire. He's saying you've gone native." "And what do you say, Sheriff?" Abigail challenged her gaze, unwavering. Brody looked at the ground. "I say a man deserves to be judged by his own actions. But I'm one voice against many. And Blackwood, I owe him. He helped me out of a bad spot a few years back. He doesn't let a man forget a debt." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "He's not a man to cross. Take his money and go. It's the only safe play." "This is my home," Abigail said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "I'm not running anymore." The sheriff sighed again, a man trapped between his conscience and his obligations. "Then God help you, ma'am," he said, mounting his horse. "Because the law can't." As Brody rode away, Cale emerged from the cabin. He had heard everything. His face was grim. "He is trying to turn the whole valley against you," Cale said. "He will use their fear." "It's not just the land, is it?" Abigail asked, looking at him. "He mentioned the spring, but he's obsessed with this specific plot. Why?" Kyle was silent for a long time, his gaze distant fixed on the mesas that burned orange in the late afternoon sun. "He does not know what he is truly trying to steal," he said finally. "The spring he spoke of, it is merely the entrance. The water flows from a place deep within the rock." He turned to face her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "My people call it Izuongolini, the breath of the mountain. It is not just water. It is a series of caves, a sacred place, a place where the spirits of our ancestors dwell. There are paintings on the walls that tell the story of our creation. It is where our medicine men go to seek visions. It is the heart of our people in this land." The revelation struck Abigail with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a fight over property rights or water. It was a fight for the soul of a people. Silas Blackwood, in his blind greed, was trying to possess a church, a holy sanctum, a place of immense spiritual power he couldn't even begin to comprehend, and her small, stubborn homestead was the only thing standing in his way. "He thinks he is fighting a lone woman and a wounded man," Kyle said, his voice low and resonant with a power she had not heard before. "He does not understand. We are not just defending a cabin. We are defending the breath of the mountain, and the spirits of my ancestors are watching." A profound sense of purpose settled over Abigail. Her personal fight for freedom had become intertwined with something far larger, far more significant. She was no longer just a woman who had run from her past. She was a guardian, a gatekeeper. That night there was no more space between them. The looming threat and the sacredness of their cause had burned away all hesitation. As the desert stars glittered in the ink-black sky, Kael told her stories of the stargazers, his people's name for the constellations. She in turn read him a passage from a book of poetry, her voice soft in the firelight. He reached out and traced the line of her jaw, his touch gentle but firm. Abigail. He said her name no longer a mystery, but a term of endearment. Your spirit is as strong as this land. And she leaned into his touch, finding not a collar of possession, but a promise of partnership. They were from different worlds, their lives a tapestry of pain and survival. But here, on the precipice of a battle, they were likely to lose. They had found a shared home. They would face Silas Blackwood and his hired guns, not as a man and a woman, but as two warriors bound by a sacred trust, ready to make their final stand at the mouth of the mountain's breath. The siege was about to begin. The final week of Silas Blackwood's ultimatum evaporated like a drop of water on a hot skillet. The air grew thick with anticipation. Abigail and Kael worked relentlessly, their movements economical, their words few. They were a single unit, their thoughts moving in tandem. They stockpiled water, barricaded the single window of the cabin with heavy planks, and created firing positions in the rocks, using the land itself as their primary fortification. Kael now moving with a grim fluidity, his wound a dull ache rather than a crippling injury, set a series of traps, deadfalls, and snares along the main approaches to the homestead, his skills turning the landscape into a weapon. The dawn of the final day broke with an ominous beauty, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. The silence of the desert was profound, a held breath before a scream. They were positioned in the rocks above the cabin, Kael with his captured rifle, Abigail with her Winchester. They had a clear view of the valley below. Around mid-morning they appeared, a dust cloud on the horizon that slowly resolved into a dozen riders. At their head, on his expensive bay horse, was Silas Blackwood. He was not sending his men this time. He was leading them. He had come to personally oversee the eradication of this defiant blot on his empire. He brings a war party for 2 people. Kael observed, his voice calm. He is not a strong man. He is a fearful one. Abigail's heart hammered, but her hands were steady on the stock of her rifle. This was it. The culmination of her escape, her survival. She was no longer running. She was the final line of defense. Blackwood's men fanned out, dismounting and preparing to advance on foot. They moved with a swaggering confidence, believing they were facing a lone woman and her savage lover. They walked directly into Kael's carefully laid plans. A cry of pain from the left flank signaled the first success, a man caught in a rope snare now dangling upside down from a palo verde tree. Another stumbled into a shallow pit lined with sharpened yucca spines. The confident advance faltered, confusion rippling through their ranks. Now, Kael whispered. They opened fire. Not a wild volley, but 2 carefully placed shots. A man aiming at the cabin spun around and fell. Another trying to take cover dropped his rifle with a cry as a bullet tore through his shoulder. The element of surprise was total. Blackwood's men, expecting a simple eviction, found themselves in a lethal crossfire, unsure of where the shots were coming from or how many people were firing. Silas roared in frustration, his face purple with rage. "They're in the rocks! Spread out! Burn them out!" The fight descended into a chaotic, desperate struggle. Bullets ricocheted off the boulders around Abigail and Kael, chipping away at their cover. Gun smoke filled the air, acrid and sharp. They moved, constantly firing from one position before ghosting to another, creating the illusion of a larger force. Kael moved with a silent, deadly grace, a phantom of the rocks. Abigail, her fear replaced by a cold, clear focus, operated her Winchester with lethal efficiency. She was no longer an Eastern lady. She was the angel of the anvil defending her sacred ground. But they were still only two. Blackwood's men, recovering from the initial shock, began a coordinated advance, using the terrain for cover their numbers, a relentless tide. A bullet grazed Abigail's arm, a searing line of fire. Kyle took a blow to the ribs from a ricochet that made him grunt in pain. They were being pinned down. The end seemed inevitable. Then from the direction of redemption, another sound. The thunder of a lone horse galloping hard. Silas Blackwood turned an oath on his lips, expecting reinforcements. Instead, he saw Sheriff Brody, his face set in a grim mask of determination, a shotgun held across his saddle. Brody had made his choice. His debt to Blackwood was paid, but his debt to his own conscience was now due. "Blackwood," Brody yelled, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "This is official town business. Lay down your arms. You are under arrest for attempted murder." The distraction was all Abigail and Cale needed. As Blackwood's men hesitated, looking from the sheriff to their enraged employer, Cale and Abigail unleashed another volley. 2 more men went down. The remaining force, seeing the law and realizing their simple job had turned into a full-blown war, lost their nerve. They began to fall back, helping their wounded, wanting no part of a fight against the law. Silas was left standing almost alone, his war party deserting him. His face was a mask of disbelief and incandescent fury. He looked at the retreating forms of his men, at the resolute figure of Sheriff Brody, and then his eyes filled with a crazed hatred locked onto Abigail as she moved to a new position. "You!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "This is all because of you. If I can't have this land, no one will—" He raised his own pistol, not aiming for Abigail, but for the crude structure of the cabin below. A single shot, a spark, and the dry timber baked by years of sun would go up like a torch. He would destroy her home, and with it the entrance to the sacred caves. But before he could pull the trigger, a shape launched itself from the rocks above. It was Kyle. He had no more bullets. He held only the broken bow he had been found with, using it now as a club. He slammed into Silas, knocking him from his horse. The 2 men crashed to the ground in a desperate, violent tangle. Silas was bigger, stronger, but Cale fought with the ferocity of a man defending not just his life, but the heart of his people. Abigail scrambled down the rocks, her rifle ready, but she couldn't get a clear shot. It ended as it began, with bare hands and brutal force. Silas, his face contorted with rage, pinned Cale to the ground, his hands going for Cale's throat. But Abigail was there. She didn't fire. She swung the heavy stock of her Winchester like a club, just as she had against the Coyotes, connecting solidly with Silas's temple. He grunted, his eyes rolling back in his head, and collapsed unconscious. Silence descended once more upon the valley, broken only by the panting breaths of the survivors and the groans of the wounded. Sheriff Brody rode up, his shotgun still held at the ready. He looked down at the unconscious form of Silas Blackwood, then at Abigail and Cale standing side by side, battered, bleeding, but unbroken. "Looks like the law finally found its way to the right side of the valley," Brody said, a weary respect in his voice. The aftermath was a blur. Brody and his hastily deputized men rounded up the remainder of Blackwood's forces. Silas was hauled away, his empire of greed and fear crumbling into the dust. Abigail and Kyle stood alone in front of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky. The cabin was scarred but standing. The land was theirs. The breath of the mountain was safe. Kyle turned to her, his face bruised but his eyes clear. He gently took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. The touch was no longer just one of partnership. It was one of profound, unspoken love, forged in fire and blood. "It is over," Abigail whispered. "No," Kyle said, his gaze sweeping over the vast, beautiful, and dangerous land that stretched before them. "It is just the beginning." They had faced the ghosts of their pasts and had not flinched. They had stood against overwhelming force and had not broken. On a devil's anvil under a relentless sun, a disgraced lady from Philadelphia and a displaced Apache warrior had found more than just survival. They had found freedom. They had found a home. And in the heart of the wild, untamed West, they had found each other. Abigail and Kael's story is a testament to the fact that home isn't always a place you are born to, but a place you are willing to fight for. It's a reminder that courage can be found in the most desperate of circumstances, and that the most unlikely bonds can forge the strongest shields against the darkness. They faced down their pasts, stood together against greed and hatred, and in the end, protected not just a piece of land, but the sacred soul of a people. Their fight was over, but their life, a new chapter written in the dust and rock of the Arizona Territory, was just beginning. If this story of survival courage and the extraordinary power of the human spirit resonated with you, please honor their tale by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who loves a powerful drama, and be sure to subscribe for more unforgettable stories from the untamed heart of the West.